Welcome to the Joe Rosenthal chapter of the USMC Combat Correspondence Association monthly speaker series. My name is Steve Spiller. I'm pitch hitting for our association historian, Tom Graves. And thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Today we welcome Montgomery or Monty Hom and Ron Chan. The two will share with us the following program titled, We Served with Pride, the Chinese-American Military Experience. Well, Monty and Ron have an extraordinary story to share dating back to the US Civil War through the present, all based on scholarly research, oral interviews, artifacts, other investigative techniques, and an overall passion for the subject, which was inspired by experiences in their youth. A little housekeeping. You will be all muted during Monty and Ron's talk, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type in to the chat function, and there will be time for questions afterwards. So welcome, Monty and Ron. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm Ron Chan, and our agenda for this afternoon is that we're going to talk about the Chinese-American GI Project. And we're going to talk a little bit about the inspiration, what drives us to want to honor our veterans. We're going to share with you a movie, an 8-minute clip that's The Road to the Congressional Gold Medal, about the Chinese-American acknowledgement and recognition for their service and sacrifice in World War II. We put together an exhibition which debuted just recently in San Francisco at the USS Hornet Sea, Air, and Space Museum, as well as the San Francisco Veterans Building. Then we're going to segue into the face of today's veteran, so you could get a sense of the drive and the direction and the inspiration of today's servicemen. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our book, Fighting in All Fronts. So what is the Chinese-American GI Project? We created this so the Chinese-American service is no longer forgotten, ignored, or silent. We've put together a whole multimedia range of deliverables focusing on Chinese-American veterans, which includes our book, a whole series of media, and at the very end, we'll share with you our URLs, so you could see our Veterans Day, our Memorial Day, the end of 75th anniversary of World War II, etc. We're also going to talk about today about some of the exhibitions. So we're going to give you a bird's eye view of what was in the exhibition as you walk through. I want to note that the exhibition is not only been delivered, but we've also actually been commissioned by 3 different museums to build permanent exhibits for them. The Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C., the Chinese Historical Society of America, as well as the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project, building on the backs of what we've already done. Something I'm very proud is that we've actually gotten the Chinese American GI Project a National Endowment for the Humanities, and it's titled The Dialogues on the Experience of War. And just very quickly on that is that I had an opportunity to go to the Kim Lau American Legion Post in New York. And there, as part of this program, we were able to sit down with about a dozen of the executive directors of the American Legion and talk about their service from all the way from World War II all the way to current day. But then we also brought in some young officers. And then they were able to discuss, not only their experience, but also discuss and ask these World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and Middle Eastern veterans of the American Legion, their experience. And that's going to be a rollout that we're going to be patterning for a national rollout soon. So let me tell you about what inspires me. So my father, Alfred Chen, he's been in the VFW as a founding and charter member for the East Bay Chinatown Post 3956. So although I'm not a veteran myself, I grew up with over 50 years of going to VFW picnics, installation dinners, Thanksgiving dinners. And even when I was very, very young, I honestly thought that Santa Claus was Chinese because I used to only go to the VFW Chinatown Christmas dinners. And that was my first experience with Santa Claus. But my dad grew up, he was born in 1924 and grew up in the Sacramento Delta, which is a very agricultural area of California. So he was the son of a sharecropper, and he spent his youth working on the ranch. He actually learned how to drive a tractor before he learned how to drive a car. And, he would be out in the the pear orchards, cutting, pruning, irrigating, and, working in the open fields as well. So that gave him actually a really good background in being a Seabee. Because what does a Seabee do? A Seabee builds, it constructs, it maintains, and that's where my dad spent World War II in 1944 in service in fortifying Midway Island for the eventual invasion of Japan. So what he did was he built Quonset huts, he helped build the berths for the ships, the submarine tenders. He also helped work on the airfields. But one thing that happened to him, that's because he was the only Chinese American on Midway Island, are two things that kind of represented that era. One was that he was told never to get within 50 yards of the perimeter. Being the only Chinese and Asian face, that would not be a good thing for him to do. The second thing that happened to him is that when he was walking on the base, that a Marine walked up to him and said, "I'm going to kill me a Jap." The Marines had a very hard time, of course, doing island hopping, and there was no love for, the Japanese. But fortunately, another Marine stepped between him and said, his name is Alfred Chan. He's Chinese and he's American. So fortunately, that diffused what would be potentially a very bad thing. But my dad kind of grew up with that because when he was in the Sacramento Delta, he was in a segregated school. Only Japanese and Chinese were in his school all the way up to high school. He was denied service in a restaurant. He was denied service in a theater. And also that when he came back from war in 1950, he tried to buy a house. My mom called the realtor and said she was interested in the house. They were very excited. The realtor actually asked, "What nationality are you?" And she said Chinese. And the next thing they heard was click. So they tried to move into a house. The seller was okay to selling to Chinese as the first Chinese on the block, but the neighbor next door was vehement. He didn't want Chinese there. What was the great irony is that he was a naval officer in World War II. My father was in the Navy in World War II. So apparently it's okay to die for your country, but you can't live next to me. So what that has motivated me to do is to not only honor my father, but every Chinese American vet, every veteran is an extension of my dad, and I honor their service accordingly. Monty, you're up.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Steve and Tom, if he's watching. This is a treat for us to do a little presentation for this wonderful group. So, Ron, are there visuals running right now?
No, it's your uncle, the boots, and your
Okay,
Coach
perfect.
Buck.
Yep, perfect. So one of the things a lot of people ask me is, how did I start this, right? So as a young boy growing up in North Beach, San Francisco, I could remember I was 5 years old watching The Sands of Iwo Jima with my grandpa and my grandma because they loved John Wayne. My grandpa worked for the Navy Department. He started working there in 1938, and he retired in 1975, right after the Vietnam War, basically. So he was a stores master for the Oakland Naval Depot there. And as a kid, I was drawn to the military stories because also of what I heard from my grandpa. And also, as I grew up, I heard these stories from an uncle who was a paratrooper with the 507th 82nd Airborne who jumped into Normandy on June 6th. So as I heard that story, I became sort of enthralled with the idea of Normandy, right? The Normandy invasion. And I went to my school library. I remember grade school, like second grade. I pulled every single book I could on Normandy, World War II, the European theater. I was hoping to find a picture of my uncle, but of course I did not. And that led me on a hunt to figure out, were there other Chinese that served in the military? And as a result, as a young boy, most kids collected baseball cards, comic books, all that stuff. But I wasn't interested in that. As I was meeting veterans, I would ask them a key question after I talked to them. I would say, "Sir, do you have anything that you saved from the war?" And then, one veteran would say, "Oh, yeah, sure. I've got an old pair of boots," right? Next guy might say, "I've got a helmet." Next guy might say, "Oh, I have an old Ike jacket." And so through the years, I've amassed this collection because of these Chinese American veterans, because I wanted to use these objects to tell a story. And I felt that in our Chinese community, because when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was many, many Chinese American veterans around from World War II at that time. They were abundant. They used to hang out in Chinatown at a place called Uncle's Cafe. Every Sunday, these guys would be from the VFW, from the American Legion, and they would get together and talk war stories. And I would just sort of slide on in there to say, "Hi, I'm just here to listen." And I was basically looked at as a kind of a mascot. And the next thing you know, I started capturing their stories. And their stories today are priceless. And I'm so blessed that I had an opportunity to talk to these men and women that served, because most of them now are gone. And so this culminates into this video that you will be watching here, which is called The Road to the Congressional Gold Medal. The Chinese have just recently received the Congressional Gold Medal signed by President Trump at the end of 2018. And over these last few years, the final medals are being given out. So Ron, let's roll it for this piece here. So please enjoy this 8-minute piece.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's hard to believe that nearly 8 decades have passed since that fateful morning on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Aloha, I'm Pamela Young. More than 16 million Americans served in our armed forces during World War II. For Chinese Americans, the story of their service to our country was nearly forgotten. Their stories of heroism and sacrifice are only now being told and recognized by a grateful nation. The Chinese-American military experience began during the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. A small number of Chinese served in the Union and Confederate forces during the bloody conflict on American soil. During World War I, Chinese Americans enlisted in the United States Army to fight in the European War.
Over there, send the word over there.
By late 1918, the doughboys of the American Expeditionary Force engaged the enemy. Chinese American soldiers distinguished themselves on the battlefields of France. By mid-1930s, Chinese Americans were about to enter a new kind of war.
This is the Battle of China. This, the fearful beginning of a new kind of war. This, the first mass bombing from the air of a helpless civilian population.
The Japanese invasion of China seemed unstoppable. Chinese Americans stepped up as volunteers to fight the Japanese forces and to help save a desperate China. America was preparing for the winds of war as it enacted its first peacetime draft in October 1940.
For the first time in our history, we began mobilizing an army while still at peace.
This is the Army, Mr. Jones. No private room for telephone.
In Chinatown, the rush is just as great and enthusiastic as elsewhere.
Chinese American draftees were among the first. The Hawaiian Islands, one of the most strategic American military sites, now became the target of aggression as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
America was now at war. The first island battle in the Pacific was fought at Wake Island. From December 8th to the 23rd, civilians aided the Marine and naval personnel against overwhelming Japanese forces, which eventually forced them to capitulate. 64 Chinese American civilian contractors were captured and sent to prison camp for the duration of the war. 22 of these men were from Hawaii. After the decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, American forces began its offensive against Germany and Japan. Chinese American personnel were now engaged in combat operations around the world. They fought at Guadalcanal, the China-Burma-India Theater, from North Africa to Sicily, from the Normandy invasion to the German Rhineland, from the Pacific to the Mediterranean and European theater of operations. Chinese Americans helped to defeat our enemies on all fronts. Up to 20,000 Chinese Americans served in World War II. In spite of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, 1 out of every 5 Chinese in America served their country. They served in every branch of service: the Army Air Forces, the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marines. For the first time, Chinese American women enlisted in the United States military. The small but significant number of Chinese American women in uniform helped to break the racial and gender barriers. They were assigned to a variety of stateside duties, and some were sent overseas. 2 Chinese American women flew with the Women's Air Force service pilots. Women on the home front stepped up as war workers at aircraft factories and naval shipyards. They served as Red Cross volunteers and also created the first Chinese USO canteen for servicemen. With the defeat of Germany and Japan, World War II was finally over. The men and women in uniform returned home. Utilizing the GI Bill and their veteran status, they ultimately helped to establish a modern, vibrant post-war Chinese community. With the advent of the 75th anniversary of the ending of World War II, an idea for congressional recognition for our Chinese American veterans began with the efforts of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. They led the way for the idea of a congressional medal for our veterans. It was to become a reality.
You know, when I started this journey with Chinese American Citizens Alliance back in 2016, we knew really that time was against us with the aging World War II veterans. We really wanted to give our World War II veterans a final honor. We had to start locating the families and survivors to get as many signed up as possible. You know, one of the goals of this project was to get the children and grandchildren involved to really see that they had made a great sacrifice for this country. Throughout their lives, many Chinese dedicated themselves to prove that we are as patriotic as any other groups who served in the military.
We wanted the medal to depict that Chinese American veterans served in every theater of war and fought on air, land, and sea. Additionally, we wanted to recognize Chinese American women that served during World War II. The common occupation was a nurse, found in the Army, Army Air Force, and the United States Navy. Although 40% of the veterans could not be citizens, they were proud to serve as Americans.
The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest award given by Congress to civilian individuals or groups, and what it really means to veterans as well as the families is final recognition for all the contributions made by Chinese Americans in the U.S. Armed Services.
We also remember the Chinese Americans who gave their lives in service to our country. Francis B. Y., Captain, 34th Infantry Regiment, United States Army. Captain Y is the only Chinese American recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Hua Kao Kong, Lieutenant, 353rd Fighter Squadron, United States Army Air Force. Harold K. Lee, Corporal, 60th Infantry Regiment, United States Army. David G. Lem, Lieutenant, 499th Bomb Squadron, United States Army Air Force.
War is a time that tries the souls of men and women. And World War II was a time when every patriotic soul was needed. America's 20,000 Chinese American veterans were there, and they stood for America and earned today's thanks, the thanks of a grateful nation. And so, to you, America's Chinese Americans veterans, thank you and God bless you. And God bless as well the nation that stands today, because on a dangerous yesterday, America's veterans, including America's Chinese American veterans, stood for her.
All right. Thank you for that, Ron. I hope you guys enjoyed that little piece that we did for the Congressional Gold Medal. But I think that kind of summarizes, right, our journey from the Civil War pretty much through to the end of World War II. That was sort of our high watermark, so to speak, right? World War II was the kind of turning point for the Chinese American community, especially for the fact that we had so many that was in the service, one out of every 5 Chinese. And you have to kind of understand back in World War II with the census of 1940, there was only about 100,000 Chinese in America at that time. So basically, my official records from the War Department showed that about 18,500 served, so a little bit under 20,000. And primarily they served in the Army, Army Air Forces, Navy, then the Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marines, of course. So that just gives you a nice little summary. And I think that that gives you also a better picture of how we started our military journey, right, in this country. Okay, Ron, take it.
So that military journey actually segued into an exhibition that we just completed in San Francisco. And the exhibition, Chinatown the Battle Crown, I wanted to thank specifically the American Legion 380 to the initiation and the energy and the inception of this exhibit. The idea was we wanted to launch locally, but deploy nationally. So what we did is that we used the American Legion and the Chinese Historical Society America to create a San Francisco debut. And the first execution of the exhibit was at the USS Hornet Sea, Air, and Space Museum. And they were executing against the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And with that, they actually had the Japanese, the Filipino, as well as the Chinese Americans represented in that gallery, which I'll show in a moment. The second place that we executed Chinatown, the Battleground, was in San Francisco at the San Francisco Veterans Building, to which I'll show you a walking tour in a moment. This is the USS Hornet. I mean, it was an amazing backdrop for the exhibit. You know, we had the Sea Scouts, we had young Marines, we had many veterans, as well as general public. And there you see part of the 16 banners that we exhibited there. And that was the USS Hornet. At Chinatown to Battleground in the San Francisco Veterans Building, we had over 200 Chinese American military artifacts. Monty, through his collection, owns the world's largest private collection of Chinese American militaria. But it's not just about the artifacts, it's the story behind the artifacts. And that's what we really wanted to focus on. We had 16 banners spanning Chinese American service from Civil War all the way to current date. What was very exciting is that the Cathay Post through the American Legion served as docents, you know, throughout the exhibition. And we had coverage from various press as well as TV. So let me show you this walking tour of this exhibition.
This exhibition, Chinatown to Battleground, is something that I've always wanted to do because we've never had a major exhibition on Chinese Americans in the military. And our history in the United States military goes back all the way to the Civil War of 1861 to Afghanistan. So the exhibition basically is two parts. One is a rich visual history, which is told through our banner art. And then basically what I wanted to do was to make sure people understood that every single one of these objects tell a story. For example, my godmother Maggie was one of 2 Chinese American pilots that flew in World War II with the Women Air Force Service Pilots, which is the WASP. She always complained that they were given these oversized, baggy, ugly men's coveralls to wear, but that's what she had to fly in, for example. We also have an early veteran of the war. He's from San Francisco named Private Eddie Feng. Now, what's notable about him is that he is the first and only Chinese American prisoner of war of the Japanese. And in our exhibit case, we have his only possession that he held throughout the entire war, which was a mess kit. And that was the only thing that he had for his water, rice, and soup. And he carried that for over 4.5 years in captivity as a prisoner of war. The Chinatown to Battleground exhibition is really kind of a first major undertaking, but it's also an important one. And I really want people to take away this big, big picture that the Chinese Americans have been involved in the United States military since the Civil War, over 150 years. So we have given service to this country, blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice for a long time. And our stories of our Chinese Americans are part of the mainstream. Chinese American history is American history. And that's the takeaway that I want people to come out with, especially the younger generation.
Thank you, Ron. That was awesome. I really wish that everyone had a chance to see this exhibit. I know that it was a fairly short time. It was about almost an 8-week window that we were able to have in place. And I really wish that more people was able to see it, because people that got the word late, they were emailing and calling, can we see it? Can we see this? And it was a kind of a wonderful environment, because it also opened the door to many other veterans that we've never known existed. We have today also a friend of ours, Alfred Louis, who is a Army veteran from Vietnam that I also met at the exhibit. And it was wonderful because he's from Galileo High School, for example, and he's with a whole group of Chinese American veterans that came out, and I call them the Galileo boys, right, from 1966, 67, 68. So we'll talk about that later. But anyway, the exhibition, as you can see, was basically twofold, and we were able to also focus on women for the first time, starting from World War II going to present day Afghanistan. So these two women, the one on the left is my godmother, Margaret Maggie G, and that is Hazel Ying Lee on the right. Hazel Ying Lee was killed in the line of duty in November of 1944. My godmother survived, of course, to tell us the final stories and experiences of the WASP. Next one, Ron. Okay, and so you could see the banner art here, and it's really kind of unique because these banner arts were created with all of our Chinese American veterans in mind, as many as we can put together. So we have everything from World War II to Korea to Vietnam. And as you can see, what we've done is we've also told the stories of these particular individuals that were highlighted. We have a Colonel Ron Wan, who's from San Francisco. He was a Navy veteran from World War II. After the war, he wanted to get into aviation, but the Navy would not take him. So he joined the Marines for a short time. And then the Marines didn't want to take him into aviation. So he lost that uniform and put on a new uniform to join the Army. And they had a flight training program in 1947 that he got into. So by 1948, he was definitely training as a pilot in the new USAF, United States Air Force, no longer the Army Air Forces of World War II. And by 1950, he was part of one of the first squadrons sent to Korea, and they went into combat in F-84 Thunder jets. And then we're going into Vietnam, as you can see, and that is Alfred Louis. And Alfred Louis is one of our distinguished veterans from Chinatown that was also highlighted at the exhibition. And Alfred Louis was in country in combat in 1969. And so from there, we move forward, of course, and the idea is that Afghanistan is another area where what we're doing is telling more stories. But I want to take one step back for the combat correspondence team. I forgot about this one photo, Ron. If you guys could see the photo at the bottom, that is an A detachment 321 from the Special Forces of 1962. On the bottom there's a Chinese American combat photographer named Al Chang, who was attached to that unit. And I knew the commander of that particular unit, as well as the first ever psychological warfare officer that was deployed in Vietnam with Special Forces at that time. And Al Chang sitting down below with his legs crossed, and on top is also a Japanese American that was part of that team. So you actually had two Asian Americans serving in 1962-63 with an A team that operated in the highlands of Vietnam. Next, please, Ron. So as we go to present day, I wanted to move forward to go to, of course, Desert Storm, Iraq and Afghanistan. And these two pictures are very synonymous because this is my wife in the center. She's about to take off in a Black Hawk. She's currently a lieutenant commander on the United States Navy in her 20th year. And she was operating in northern Afghanistan in 2018 to 2019 before the fall of Afghanistan. On the right is one of our board members, Colonel Willem Wong, who was also attached to Special Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he served 2 tours of combat in Afghanistan. Next one, Ron.
Okay, would you like to introduce Alicia before I start the video?
Oh, yes, of course. So we have my wife's first cousin, who is a West Point graduate, and she is one of the first women to be admitted to West Point, one of the first Chinese American women, excuse me. And she was also one of the first Chinese American women boots on the ground right after 9/11 to go into combat with her combat engineer battalion. And so this is Captain Alicia Chin. Thank you, Ron.
My name is Alicia Chin Greer. I was born in Silver Spring, Maryland in 1977. My first experience with the Army was when I arrived at West Point in 1995. Even though my grandfather was a World War II veteran, he died when I was about 8, so I was really young. I graduated from West Point on May 29th, 1999, and I was commissioned as an engineer officer. To the best of my knowledge, I'm the first Chinese American woman to graduate from West Point. And I served in the 92nd Engineer Battalion at Fort Stewart, Georgia. I was just 24 when the attacks of 9/11 happened. And I remember hearing it on the radio as I was lacing up my boots that morning. I froze in shock for what seemed like an eternity to me, though I'm sure it was only a brief second or two. And then I rushed into my unit. And I remember talking to another lieutenant later that day, and we agreed that we could feel a sort of bubbling that was happening inside of us. And we felt an incredible sense of duty and yet this undeniable anxiousness about what was going to happen next. But just a few weeks later, I was pulled into my battalion commander's office, and he looked at me and he said, "Alicia, the 92nd has been tasked to send a company plus a headquarters detachment, and we're choosing Bravo Company." And that was the moment that I put on my game face and everything became methodical. I had a mission to accomplish. I had to get our unit over, boots on ground within weeks in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. We were the first Army engineers in Afghanistan. And actually, we were there so early that we didn't have forces in Afghanistan yet. We were actually in Uzbekistan, where we were launching operations into Afghanistan. It was surreal, like existing in a movie, though not at all like the movies that Hollywood produces. When you're at war in another country, you learn a lot about yourself. And it's both awful and wonderful at the same time. There's a lot of ugly happening out there, but the relationships that are forged with the people to your left and right are indescribable. We were eating, sleeping, and drinking the effects of that war together. The amount of physical, emotional, and mental stress and volatility is pretty incredible. And to be honest, I'm still processing it today. It's been decades, and I'm still processing it. I have moments when I have burst into tears and I've hyperventilated, or I've started physically shaking when seemingly innocuous things trigger these memories that I have tucked inside. After we redeployed from Afghanistan, the ground war in Iraq began, and less than a year later, we were at war again. Only this time we were in Iraq.
I'd like to introduce our book, Fighting on All Fronts. As you could tell, Monty and I, we are very visual and we're very graphically oriented. And not only did we approach that with our exhibition and our various videos, but also the book that we did. You know, one thing that's very special about this cover is that it was designed by the artist Russell G. Chong. And these are not just random faces. These are individual portraits that have tributes tied back within the book. We have over 200 Chinese American World War II tributes in this book. And it's broken out by service, where you have Army, Air Corps, Navy, Marines, etc. And in this book, you know, our desire was to ensure, as I noted earlier, that the Chinese American experience is not ignored or forgotten or silent. So with 238 pages, we wanted to make sure that their voices are heard. Somebody told me one time that you actually die twice. Once when you draw your last breath, and once when your name is said for the very last time. With this book, we ensure that the memory of our World War II vets remain. Monty, would you like to close with some last thoughts? Take off, unmute, please.
Thank you. It's been an emotional journey, everyone, especially after COVID. You know, I felt that there was this really urgent need to make sure that our Chinese Americans from World War II would be remembered in the fullest way as possible, simply because so many has passed. And with COVID, that was another very terrible thing that took the life of many of these veterans as well. And one of the things that I could say would be the bright spot would be that all this information that we've captured, all the work that I've done over my last several decades, is that we want a permanent place for this in the future, because the Chinese American military history is American history. You know, this is not just for the Chinese or Asian American audience. I mean, we are part of the flag. And I feel that as the generations go on, for example, World War II is passing us and Korea is passing us, right? Because they're not much older than, they're not much younger than the World War II veterans. So now we come to really Vietnam, which is where we've met Alfred Louis and some of his men and friends, that we realize that their stories need to be told, and they are they're next in line from that particular generation, because Vietnam now is considered a long time. So we want to ensure that our work continues, that we continue to capture these stories. We want to have a place that we're able to disseminate these stories around the United States, around the world, that we are part of the American flag. And so the honor, the service, the sacrifices of the Chinese Americans will never be forgotten. And we want to make sure that we continue our mission and our journey to tell these stories into the future. So thank you very much for your time. It's been wonderful.
Monty, would you like to share some of the stories behind the pictures on screen?
Oh, sure. Let me go ahead and pull that open. Okay. Yeah, so as part of our final journey recently, you see these three photos. The left one with the individual pointing up, that's Alfred's father, Alfred Chan, US Navy Seabee veteran from World War II. So it was great to have him come in. And on the right, the man with the red jacket, that is Corporal Randall Ching, 5th Ranger Battalion. So he insisted on getting up from his wheelchair to take this portrait next to him, his photo in the banner. And Randall is quite really remarkable individual, especially from his World War II combat experience to this day. So I'm so happy that he's still obviously with us, and he's a tough guy, tough fighter. And of course, in the center is our illustrious Alfred Louis. And Alfred surprised me because we had lunch one day in Chinatown, and he says, "I've got something for you, Monty." And what he did was he brought out a little bag, and he had his khakis and look at his boots from Vietnam, and he surprised me. So I wanted to kind of take this picture with the Chinatown backdrop like that, and Alfred holding his boots, because to me, that was essentially such a story. And this is the story of our veterans, that most of these people, even in our own community, do not know these guys, do not even understand what they did for this country, yet alone for their community. So Alfred, big thanks to you, my friend. And so these are the stories that we want to continue telling, and we want to tell new stories and perpetuate this even further into the future.
Well, I'm looking at the photo on the right, and the red jacket that he's wearing is an honor flight jacket. And I know that there are veterans that are listening in. And if you're not familiar with honor flight, they have transported 250,000 veterans to Washington, D.C. to visit the memorials and monuments dedicated in their service. They pay for your air, they pay for your hotel, they pay for your meals, they pay for your transportation, but you actually did pay for this through your service. So if you're not familiar with honor flight, I please suggest you go there because they started flying post-COVID. But I just told that story also to tell a story that my father and I went on an honor flight. And with that, I was working at the time, and somebody just oddly asked, "Well, what are you going to do this weekend?" Just kind of a throwaway, just to chit chat. And I told him I was going to DC with my dad on this honor flight. And she got very excited because, her elementary school child was learning American history. So the teacher that they contacted said, "Well, can we write letters to thank your dad for his service?" So there were actually about probably 24 letters, but 2 of them really stood out. One was, "I can't believe you're still alive." The second one was, "Who won the war?" And that was horrifying and hilarious, both at the same time. Because, my father's generation is near gone. Of the 16 million that served, only about 300,000 or less of the World War II veterans are still alive. My generation will be gone in 20 years. So is the next generation going to be left with who won the war? I hope not. And that's what I hope that legacy that Monty and I leave, in capturing the moments of time for World War II vets and moving forward to Korea, to Vietnam, and to the current day veterans. Our story will continue. So with that, thank you. And if there's any questions, we'll be happy to entertain. Under the For More Information slide that's up there, there's the QR code as well as the URL for the Chinese American GI website. There's also a Facebook page where we have well over 800 members. And you'll see a lot of stories there. And then the last one is our Facebook page for Chinatown, the Battleground, which focuses primarily on just the exhibit itself and, some of the things that people have seen. So we invite you all to come to our site, contribute to our site. And, in the website itself, we even have something called Profiles of Service, where we have a 2-minute video, 100 words and 4 photos that you could post of your veteran, to thank him for his service.
Well, thank you, Monty and Ron. I appreciate your passion, your dedication to documenting the story.